suddenly occlusion becomes more simple. You have to work less hard because all you've got to do is make sure there's good posterior guides. And all that work you're doing at the front of the mouth, as long as you don't get too much of a clash there, okay, then life becomes much, much more simple. And canine guidance isn't a bad thing, but it's not essential to a healthy, functional bite.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But Andy, most specialists would call that, if you say to a specialist, well, in this case, we can accept the degree of class 2 in this case, they would then say, okay, so you're going for a compromised treatment plan. And
right.
that term then makes it almost undermines your entire thought process and what you're trying to do for the patient. Hey guys, and welcome to episode 32. This is Posterior Guided Occlusion Part 2 with Dr. Andy Toy. Now, I left you on a massive, massive cliffhanger last time, and I hope you can join us again to get the complete story of how to actually apply the PGO concepts. Now, something like I told you guys, it was me learning a bit about this concept for the first time, like many of you. So it might take me some time to implement this if I do end up fully going that way, but it's just great to hear other points of views and other theories out there. So I'm so glad that Dr. Andy Toy was able to share that all with us. Before we join Dr. Andy Toy on the show again with part 2, I'm going to give you the Protrusive dental pearl. And this is a photography one, which has been quite big on my Instagram story recently. I sort of gave a hint that I've invested in some new sort of photography flashes, some lighting, and I'm going to go into a lot of detail about that because loads of people inquired about how to get that nice softer lighting. So I'm going to do a whole segment on that. I think it'll be cool for everyone, and also how I can do it for way cheaper than buying it from some other places. So I'm going to show you the sort of the DIY method of how to make the softer lighting and save you lots of money at the same time. A dental photography tip for the Protrusive dental pearl for today, which is when you're taking your portrait photo, which is important to do, and I think with more experience you realize the importance of it as you go on. And if anyone's doing orthodontics, you're probably used to taking portrait photos anyway. So when you're taking portrait photos, especially with a ring flash, which is the most common flash that people have for dental photography, the lighting can be quite harsh. So if you can just very simply unclip the ring flash from the lens and point it up towards the ceiling. Now, most people have like a white ceiling. Point it up to the ceiling, and this will really enhance your portrait photograph. It will make it much more softer lighting. It'll enhance the features. So that will be my Protrusive dental pearl. Point the flash to the ceiling, not directly at your patient. The other two things I want to tell you is that I've added one more book to my book list, which is protrusive.co.uk/books. And this is The Danish Way of Parenting. Again, if you're already following me on Instagram, you would have heard me on my story talking about the lessons I learned from this book as a father, and how Danish people are the happiest in the world. And I think it's because they have a really happy upbringing. So what lessons can we learn? So I recommended that as a book on my sort of book list. And the last thing I want to talk about before we jump straight to the podcast is, for those of you who missed my butterfly effect webinar that I did for the deanery, that's now online, and you can catch that on protrusive.co.uk/butterfly. And this is about a little bit of my story about how I always wanted to be a restorative consultant, how that was my real focus. But then, life happens, life comes in the way, and how I've navigated my career path, and how I do believe that little things, small influences compounded over time can change the trajectory of your career. So it's all about the butterfly effect, the little changes, and how they may result in big changes in your future. So check out that free webinar online on protrusive.co.uk/butterfly, and let's jump straight to Andy Toy's part 2 with PGO. Hope you enjoy. Angles and Andrews, and it continues on from there. Yeah,
it's part of the structural school of orthodontics. Okay, what I would say. And so when I try and make a difference for people, I say, well, you either, this is a structural way of looking at it. We have a functional way of looking at it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But Andy, most specialists would call that, if you say to a specialist, well, in this case, we can accept the degree of class 2 in this case, they would then say, okay, so you're going for a compromised treatment plan. And
right.
that term then makes it almost undermines your entire thought process and what you're trying to do for the patient. Right.
And so we have the evidence to show that the compromised, so-called, is actually the best way of treating this patient. Because I'm going to give you now, probably because we've been going on a bit, but I'm going to give you what I think is the killer piece of evidence. Okay. So Ron Presswood is busy working through all this stuff. I tell you part of the story here that really got him onto this was he's at a party, and a patient of his comes up to him and says to him, Ron, my son has just been to the LVI, the Las Vegas Institute. He's had his mouth restored. He's in terrible, terrible pain. Okay? And can you do something? So Ron basically goes to see, takes the guy to his practice that evening. And in the LVI, I don't know what they do now, to be honest, because I don't really look at them. But what they used to do in those days was they would fit all these muscle monitors on there. They'd get you to the so-called point of neutrality or whatever it is.
They still do that. I've seen it firsthand in practice.
Okay. And they invariably then you had to open up the bite by 6 or 7 millimeters, and you needed 28 units of crown and bridge. Okay.
34.
Oh, 30. And what they'd done with this guy, they'd opened him up and they'd locked him into this position. He was in terrible pain. So what Ron had to do was basically grind away all this porcelain and free him up. Okay. And Ron is like incandescent at this point because he knew this lad. He'd been a patient of his because he's part of the family. And his mouth has been wrecked because people are following this model of occlusion that the LVI were purporting at the time with so-called evidence that we never see. But he says, well, I've got this other idea, but I haven't got the evidence. How can I go out there and say you're wrong when it's just my opinion? So that really what set him on the road to really, really work on the evidence. So he went over to Australia to work with the anthropologists over there, went there 3 or 4 times. The anthropologists in Australia got masses of evidence, but they're academics, they're not clinicians. So it doesn't really flip over into how we translate their evidence into practice, okay? Anyway, he's talking about this with his son, Ron Jr. Ron Jr. Is an engineer. In fact, he's a space engineer because he worked for NASA. Ron's from Texas. He lives in Houston. So he's saying to Senior, saying to Ron Jr., he says, well, you know what? There's this relationship between the way the condyle works and moves and the way the teeth glide over each other, okay? And Ron Jr. says, well, if that's true, then we should be able to find the maths that describes that. So, and Ron Jr. had been working on, actually at that point, the docking mechanism for the space station modules, okay? Which is a bit like a cusp going into a fossey, if you think about it. And through space, these two bodies are moving, okay, and they got to understand how they're going to join up together, and there's a mathematical relationship for that. So they go off to the University of Texas. They get 12 skulls from the anthropological department, and if Ron's supposition is correct, then the occlusal surfaces of the second molars and the functional surface of the joint, okay, which is Zola's tubercle, and actually they looked at the canine on the opposite side. If they have a relationship, then you should be able to find the mathematical relationship, mathematical equation that describes that. Because Ron's idea was that as the condyle moves, you know, when you're chewing and everything, all that is in contact as well, and you may well have a contact over on the canine as well. Everything is in harmony, okay? So they take 12 skulls. They have to build an extra powerful computer in them days, and they did a digital scanning of those 3 points. They gave it to a friend of Ron Jr.'s, who was Ed Henkel. He's another NASA space engineer. And he basically did the scans, and they found the equation that links the functional surfaces of the joint to the functional surfaces of the teeth. Now, I don't care about what your science is, but when you put an equation in there, that, to me, is proof that you should have a posterior guide that it matches the condylar motion of the in the joint. So we have the equation that proves this. One of the frustrations for me is we have gone to the articulating manufacturers, okay, especially the digital guys, and we're saying, do you know what, guys? If you gave us a CBCT and we found 2 of the points, we can map all the other points because we have the equation that does that. And it's non-linear maths. And the guys Ed Enkel said, he did all different skull sizes. He said 12 is enough. There's enough synchronicity here that everything comes together. So we talk about evidence. I've not seen any other model of occlusion come up with significant evidence like that. Never mind our own clinical experience that we get, just as you're describing. So, going for the patient's present occlusion, okay, the occlusion they walk in with, providing that the joint is healthy and they can chew everything and they're not in discomfort, I think we're obliged to keep to that occlusion whenever we can. So it's not a compromise.
That's really fascinating. I mean, when you told me that story the first time, and then when I read your ebook and I looked into it and I saw the skulls, and I learned what a centrum was, because I have to admit, it's not something in the spoons and stuff. So it's certainly very, very interesting. And the fact that you have, your comparison of the evidence that you present against what the occlusion world presents at the moment, I totally get it. Because one thing that I was always taught by my mentor and principal, Hap Gill, who is a fellow panky guy like yourself, and he always told me, look, Jazz, all this occlusion stuff, there's actually, you have to firstly respect there's no evidence for this stuff. So that's why I was also very open to what you had to say, because I know that the evidence for a lot of what we apply doesn't exist. Yeah.
So always, as good clinicians, right, I know Hap's like this as well, you have to take all this in, just like I did as well, and you then go and try it out on your own patients. And when you try it out with splints, then it's in a reversible manner. And I know Hap, and, he was saying how actually what you see is suddenly occlusion becomes more simple. You have to work less hard because all you've got to do is make sure there's good posterior guides. And all that work you're doing at the front of the mouth, as long as you don't get too much of a clash there, okay, then life becomes much, much more simple. And canine guidance isn't a bad thing, but it's not essential to a healthy, functional bite. So that makes life a lot simpler. So good occlusion is really very simple, which is bad for me in one way, because if I made it really complicated, you could pay me a lot of money to come and give you 5 days.
Your textbook would be 1 page, because literally the last minute of what you said there is essentially the crux of it. So I think my opening snippet to the podcast episode will be exactly that 45-second what you said there. So is this a good time for me to then ask you some questions, which a lot of people might be thinking at the moment out there listening to this, people who've never come across PGO. I mean, I think I will try it out on splints and go from there. But it's interesting. We mentioned about Hap Gill, and one of my first experiences is when he gave me the job offer to work with him, and I went to shadow him a few times. So he was just finishing up an Invisalign case, and he removed the attachments, and now he's checking the bite. And okay, I know what he's going to be doing here. I'll watch. So he's checking the bite, and it's a young female, and she's now excursing left and right. And you're a very long way away from canine guidance. There is no canine guidance at all. And I saw him do his thing, bit of adjustments, check. Okay, everything feels smooth, good. Okay, fine. We'll talks about retention, and the patient goes away. And me, I respect Hap very much, even now, of course, more than ever, as our relationship has grown over the years. But I said to him very sheepishly, like, Hap, what about canine guidance? Aren't you worried there was no canine guidance? And he said to me, whoever taught you all that rubbish, just forget it, There's no evidence for that stuff. And that's what really got me thinking. I was already very much into occlusion, and I've been more and more, and I love respecting and listening to all the schools of thought. So thank you so much for sharing the origins of PGO, the origins of the structural viewpoint of occlusion, which is important to know that actually it may have started from a dream in 1884. Yeah. Very fascinating to learn that. So now let's talk about real world and how to apply it. And some of the questions that we have. So the first question I have is about definitions, right? Okay. Function for me is, in my map of the world at the moment, is a function is, or masticatory oral function is speech, swallowing, and chewing. That for me is function. So in speech, speech, chewing, and swallowing.
Yeah, of course.
So in swallowing, yes, we need a contact like MIP or whatever, so to be able to swallow. So there's contact during swallowing. There is no contact during speech, unless there's some degree of parafunction going on in that sense. And chewing, there are some fleeting contacts, but from what I understand, there shouldn't be any hard or significant contacts while we're chewing. Otherwise, it's a lot like when you're walking up the stairs and you miss a step and suddenly you feel a thud. You'd feel a lot of that. So when I was reading your ebook and I was reading the slide you very kindly sent me over while I was in the last couple of days, there's a lot of, and the way you mentioned it was about, the functional movements. But you see, in my map of the world, that doesn't fit into the functional movements because it doesn't fit into what I just said there. So what do you mean by these functional movements? And when you go into the high force and you grind back to the middle, that shouldn't happen in normal function in chewing is what my belief is.
Yeah. So there's two aspects to that. Firstly, you do get these fleeting movements, fleeting contact. Okay. And so you want to make sure that there's not a tooth that's in the way. So that's where the freedom thing comes in. But there's another important thing, and that is something called the healthy clench. Mm-hmm. The body needs a chance to fire up those muscles without the teeth being in the way and the condyle seated properly. So the purpose of the splint is to enable those muscles to fire and to have the healthy clench. So there is a time, and I don't know, I'll be honest with you, I don't know how much it is. People might have done research on it, but there is so many times in the day when you do need to clench and be able to move around a little bit. Now, I've had an interesting experience in myself. This is a research study of one, okay? Because I had my Invisalign done. I wear my Vivera retainers. And I can tell you, and this wasn't an aim of treatment, but I went from about 35 millimeters opening with a deviation to one side. By the time nowadays, I got 45 millimeters opening, no deviation, no clicks. Okay, a slight one here. Right? When I take my Viveras out in the morning, I can't feel my back teeth touching.
Okay.
Now then, I was just waiting for, my mouth and my head to explode because I didn't get my back teeth touching. They generally come back during the day. One of the things I realize is actually your bite changes throughout the day. Mm-hmm. And I go back to my osteopathic and chiropractic friends and they say, well, it's all about where's your jaw posture and muscles change and fluid balance change and things like that. So one of the things about a functional approach is you don't get too hung up about the actual contact, but you do want good function. And what I think happens is when my Viveras are in, during the night, I'm doing a bit of clenching. This has really toned up the muscles here. The function's really improved. And the fact that I can chew without my back teeth actually touching, because I can chew everything all day, no problem. And so it must be that at night, I'm just going to the gym a little bit, and I've got a nice posterior guided occlusion, good contact in the centrums, and everything's fine. So I think that there is a certain amount of time during the day or night, during the 24-hour period, when the patient should be able to get into that centrum, that little spoon thing there, and just grind around a little bit. So we call it the healthy clench. And this is one of the other things that, your average approach to occlusion says you must stop clenching and grinding's bad and stuff like that. So can I tell you just one little bit about bruxism then?
Please. This is exactly what I want to do. I want to stimulate debate about bruxism, parafunction, because you were hitting all the right points. I come from a background where parafunction is bad, the teeth shouldn't touch. It is essentially the background coming. And then what you're telling me now, and it makes sense because, to be fair, and I spoke about it with the episode, Barry Alton, Barry Glassman, is that we're all complaining nowadays that so many of our patients are parafunctioning. And sometimes I think, hang on a minute, maybe that should be the norm. Because if 90% of our patients are parafunctioning, maybe it's the 10% who aren't that are the abnormal.
Yeah. So for instance, all right. So a certain amount of wear is normal. That's one of the things. Now, we don't get this in the UK so much, but in the US, if you had, I don't know, you'd lost like a millimeter of enamel or something, that's a reason to restore the tooth because it's not looking like a virginal tooth, right? And if they can crown it, they'll do it. That's the way they are.
I'm sorry, guys, to listen in the States, but it's kind of true.
I'm talking about the 80s and 90s, go to Panky, see some fantastic dentists and doing brilliant preps. And this is the way we thought, every tooth must have that cusp to fossil relationship and all that sort of stuff. If you look at the anthropological evidence, you'll see that teeth are designed to wear. So some wear is normal. And if you think about what is equilibration, it's really just advancing the wear a little bit that we should have had if we were on a proper natural diet. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that little bit of freedom to move around, that little bit of wear is a good thing. So that's part of it. Where was I going to?
You were talking about bruxism. You mentioned bruxism.
Bruxism. Yeah. Right. Okay. Now then, Ron, I had assumed that bruxism was something to do with up here, right? I was thinking it's not really anything to do with occlusion. People brux. It's something to do with something that's going on, mentally, emotionally, or whatever it is. And I start talking to Ron. He says, actually, I find that when we give them a posterior guided splint, the bruxism stops. Okay. And I think it's because they're bruxing because there's something that's in the way and they're trying to get rid of it. And as soon as we get rid of that noxious contact, and if you think about the way they adjust occlusions, they'll say, is there anything that doesn't feel quite right? Feels like it's in the way? Just here. Shall I adjust it? Yes, please. Oh, that feels better. What you're doing with equilibration is just giving them some bit of freedom. Okay. So anyway, we decided to do a study on this at Loughborough University. And we couldn't, this is interesting, we couldn't recruit a single student to this study because what we wanted to do was give them a canine guided splint, right, with sort of moderate steepness. They then had to wear that for 28 nights. Then they'd have a rest for 28 nights. And then we'd give them a posterior guided splint, so no anterior ramp. And just to mix it up a bit, they may start with the posterior guided splint and finish with the canine guided splint. Anyway, Steph Forrester goes through her lot of students. Not one single student was willing to have any dental procedure done, even though it was a splint. So I had to recruit 12 FDs, right?
Is it because it's not sexy to wear a splint? Is that what it is?
I don't know. But they were happy to have stuff put on their muscles, and fighting different things. But they were not happy to go and have impressions and stuff like that. So I had to recruit 12 FDs, and fair play, we got them in, and we went through the study. We tried to show, we tried to do sort of laser imaging of the splints to show the different wear patterns. It was a failure. Okay, we couldn't get decent data out of that. They did show, like we expected, that in the canine guided splint, when you moved off to one side and the other, the muscles switched off. So we could show that. But the other thing that we did is we took photographs of the splints. So we then compared the wear patterns on the acrylic of the canine guided splints and the posterior guided splints. Mm-hmm. Okay? Because you can tell, once they've worn a splint for 28 days, if they're grinding, you can see the effect of the occlusal contacts on there. Yep. You know what I mean? And we also asked them, we gave the subjects then a questionnaire to fill in about comfort and stuff like that. So there was no evidence of bruxism on the posterior guided splint. And on every canine guided splint, they'd been grinding up and down the ramp because you could see the acrylic had been worn in because we compared the photographs of when we fitted it to when we looked at it after 28 days. And 11 of the 12 subjects reported better comfort with the posterior guided splint, and the other one was neutral. Mm-hmm. So to me, it was strong evidence for Ron's assertion that if you will grind your teeth if you don't have good centrums, good posterior guides. And you could well be grinding because you're trying to get rid of something.
Yeah.
Now I know that, invariably now when I get sent a patient from a dentist to deal with their TMD, quite often they've had some anterior dentistry done in some way, and they've restricted their path of motion, And so they've not got that contact at the backs that they used to have, and they're starting to get problems. Okay, so it's usually the dentistry looks too good, and it's too anatomical, and it's not functional enough. So that's one of the reasons, we talk about in the diploma, overjet's your friend. Basically, build in 2 or 3 millimeters of overjet, give them some freedom in Centric, as beautiful, so a panky. So there you go. So I wouldn't say hand on heart that every parafunctional situation, every bruxism is due to an occlusion issue, but it's certainly significant. And Ron, being a panky dentist, he takes photographs of his patients' splints year after year after year, and he's got photographs of people, came in with massive parafunction. 20 years later, their splint looks just the same, no grinding.
I respect that a lot. As someone who takes photos of my patient's splints, and as many of my listeners know, I get a Sharpie pen, I color my splint in, and I can see the patterns. And to be fair, 80-90% of the splint work I'm doing is anterior only, whether it's B splint, FOS, NTI. So this is why I'm excited to be exposed to this type of learning. But what you said there about how one might want to grind away that canine guidance because it's in the way, and I completely see that. But it's funny how in those lectures by the quote unquote occlusion gurus, you all seen that case where they say, oh, this patient, we need to restore them because they've now lost canine guidance and now they're parafunctioning on their posterior teeth. This is really bad. The forces are high. And the very crux of occlusion is let's rebuild, let's anteriorize this occlusion. And it's just, so why do you think that we dentists, yourself, even when you used to do Tanners and Michigans, how can you attribute the success that we can get from doing anterior dentistry?
Okay. So what does the Tanner appliance do? And I'm talking about a flat plane appliance, pretty flat here. That's the way that we were taught at Panky. Sure. I mean, it basically opens them up.
Yep.
Right, and allows them to move around a little bit. And when they clench, that posterior guide comes in. Okay. But I'm not checking for that because when I was doing the side to side, it was just gliding movements.
Yeah. I can see that.
Movements. So it's just back to Bayron's work in 64. So the point is 100% of people have posterior guides. That's what we found on those dentists, even the ones that have been equilibrated. Okay? So the reason that the splint has worked is because we opened them up and we allowed them a bit of freedom, and it's flattened the whole thing off. And I'm not going to get into this right now, but there's been a bit of work done with the denture system that's come out of this, and this is where John Bill comes in, the denture technician. When you open up, with dentures, you can open up the vertical.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll tell you a little bit about it. I don't know if you make full dentures anymore. I haven't made one in years.
I make about 2 or 3 a year.
Okay, so a good full denture. On what basis is it made? Curves of Spey and Wilson.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what we tend to follow.
That's right. Now, what is the radius of the curves of Spey and Wilson?
Radius, I'm going to say it's based on the work of 4 inches Bonwell's triangle, right?
It's 4 inches, right? So they set up a denture occlusion based on Bonwell's work, and the denture occlusion is symmetrical. And it's a linear movements, and you're putting it into a non-linear system. So John Bill's this denture technician in Leicester. He's my denture technician. He's always trying to solve problems. And one day he comes to me because he was working with a dentist, and he was setting these dentures up in the most perfect occlusion that you could get them set up. He'd put them in the mouth, and he'd say slide from side to side, and they're flipping all over the place. So he'd grind them down until they stopped moving. Okay, and he found it was steeper. The occlusal plane was steeper on one side and flatter on the other. It was asymmetrical.
Yeah.
So he comes to me. He says, "Andy, you know about occlusion? I'm grinding them down like this from the perfect curves, and I'm finding it steeper on one side, flatter on the other. Is that right?" I said, "You've got to meet Ron." Because Ron had found the same things on the dentate patients. So as a result of that, with Ron Jr., they developed a whole new denture system called CQR, okay? And the occlusal planes of the dentures match the patient's own asymmetric condylar movements. And when you get that, you get absolutely stable dentures. And did I direct you to the site which showed the videos on that? Because
No.
we've got videos to show. You can.
Are you happy to for the listeners and viewers of this podcast to? I'm sure I'd be happy to share the ebook. But my listeners love downloads. So if you've got any videos, that sort of stuff, they will loyally watch it, because I'm sure people who listen to it are genuinely interested in parafunction, occlusion, different concepts, dentistry, and all. So
I get that, because we're the same. And the thing about showing it on a denture is you can immediately see instability, right? Mm-hmm. And the thing to get your head around is that occlusion on a denture, functional occlusion on a denture, is the same as functional occlusion in the mouth on a dentate patient. And when it's unstable on a denture, when the occlusal planes are not in the right place, the denture moves. You can see it straight away. When it's in the mouth, you don't see the teeth moving. It's what's happening up here that you don't see as unstable. Or maybe there's some fractural forces on the teeth. Or maybe the periodontium's getting stressed. We can't see it. But you can see it in the denture. That's why I often show the denture videos to help you understand what's happening in a dentate patient. Anyway, what John Bill understood then, when we start to build these dentures with functional planes that match the patient, as you open up the vertical, the steepness of those curves changes.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Right? Because actually you're on a different part of the condylar surface.
Yep.
So what happens, so in his average sort of facial height, he said it's steeper on the right than the left. And we haven't found anybody yet who's the other way around, okay? But as you open up the vertical, it becomes much flatter both sides. Mm. So what do we do when we put a splint in and put a flat plane splint in? We're basically creating that, and we're allowing them to move around. And they can really then free up, the muscles start working, and when they really clench, that little posterior guide comes in. Mm-hmm. That's why I think the splints work.
Brilliant. That was a good answer. That was not like a politician at all. I asked the question, why are they successful? And I think you've answered that in a different way. And it's back to what we said earlier about a different way to explain the reason why we see success in what we do. And I appreciate that. How are we doing for time, Andy? Because I've got some more questions. Are we doing okay?
Yeah, far away.
Fine. So you mentioned about the muscles having the correct amount of function, how is it that you worded it in terms of the muscles being able to contract in a coordinated manner and with enough volume, would you say? Or how would you?
Yeah, volume of contraction, maximum contraction. That's what the SEMG measures.
Sure. Well, what I do is, as part of every new patient examination myself, is I always palpate the muscles of examination, and I make a note of the degree of hypertrophy, and I either quote say they are normal, what they feel to me, or if I feel a bit of a bulge, then I say okay, they're mildly hypertrophic. And if I feel a bulge of the masseter, that's, let's say, more than 3 or 4 millimeters, I'm being subjective here, and those patients, very square jaws, really severely hypertrophic masseters, well, are they all normal, or is there, at what point do you say, okay, this patient is, you get these very thin, slender ladies in and they bite together. Are you biting together? Yes, I am, but you can't feel any contraction. Whereas others, you feel a massive bulge. So what is normal?
Well, let's take it away from dentistry and look at the people walking down the street. Okay? They're all walking, perfectly happy, healthy, can do whatever they want. Some of them have got tiny little muscles. Some of them have got big muscles. To me, that's a structural point of view. You look at things from a structural viewpoint, okay? I'm more about the function. So one of the things that I do, and generally this is with TMD patients, and one of the reasons we've not done research on patients in pain, because pain is complex.
Yeah.
Let's remember that pain is actually felt up here. So whilst they may feel it's their joint, their tooth, their neck, whatever it is, there may actually be nothing wrong with those. It's all up here. Could be that. So I need to sort of determine, is there an occlusal element to this patient's head and neck pain? So what I do is I get them to clench, and I do my own SEMG, just like we did then, and I feel any movement, and I do it up here as well, okay? I then put some cotton rolls in, and I see if the volume changes, because I'm more interested in the volume of movement and the coordination rather than the size of the muscle. So that's a functional point of view rather than a structural point of view.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the reason why I'm so hung up on the size is because I do believe, and it's something I feel I do observe, is that for those who have larger muscles and are parafunctioning, they are destroying their teeth more. They're able to generate more lows. I'm getting more fractures of crowns, and I'm using zirconia instead of Emax or gold in those patients. So it informs my dentistry and my approach. These patients come back and they're the ones who are breaking the splints, for example, because they have the strong muscles. So that's why I can sort of relate it to maybe not function, but to parafunction.
Yeah. Okay. So, but what I would say was, I'm more interested in the volume of movement rather than the size of the muscle. And it's a useful tool as well, actually, because one of the things that we have to do, particularly with a pain patient, is we have to build trust with them. Okay. And I'm sure that the more they trust you, the more the pain goes away, frankly. That's part of it. But I say to them, I need to try and work out whether your bite makes a difference to the muscles, and if it does, it's possible that it's part of the problem that you have is problems with the muscles here and the joint not being stable. Okay. Mm-hmm. You tend to get pain from muscles that don't work rather than muscles that do work, right? So just be aware of that as well.
I do. I think I've observed that because people who've got these hypertrophic muscles, their muscles are not tender. I do palpate them, and they then seldom tender.
Right. So, I mean, I've broken my arm in the past, and I can tell you have to hold it still for like 3 or 4 weeks. I'm desperate to move those muscles, and the muscles that hurt are the ones that you can't get working. And there's good evidence to show, a healthy muscle has good blood flow through it, and a painful muscle doesn't. So that's all another thing. We want movement, we want function. Okay. So I get the patient and I say, okay, let's test you now. And I get them to put their hands on the temples, because it's usually the temporalis that doesn't react. And I get them to bite together, and they can feel maybe it goes beep, beep like this. Okay. Or it's fluttering on one side. Okay. And then I put the cotton rolls in and we see if it makes a difference. And often it's going whoop, whoop. And they go, oh, that made a difference. And my assumption is when the muscles do this, then they're going to be healthier, less pain, better function than when it's doing this.
That makes sense. Right? In someone who respects what physios do, and like you said, osteopaths and stuff, that's very much the functional matrix. I can see that viewpoint.
Right. So that's what I'm testing on muscles. I do test for trigger points as well. And one of the things I would say I've never seen you test a muscle or work with a muscle, but one thing I've learned from the physical medicine people, particularly the cranial osteopaths, is that, we need to develop a real light sense of touch in our fingers. We tend to use metal instruments, and I've seen dentists really squidging around here. That's particularly rough on a TMD patient. I just go in, I'm feeling the quality of the muscle in that, and you're sort of tuning in. And if you touch them and they feel pain, it's pain. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter that it's all up in here, it's still pain. So, and I've learned a lot from Ron Presswood here. Ron is in his mid-70s now. They've got lockdown in Houston. Do you know what? He's still working. He's still working because he gets 2 or 3 referrals every week from local psychiatrists and MDs and people like that with people in pain. And he's worked out, I can see these people on my own. But you watch how he and his team handle somebody in extreme chronic facial pain, and you recognize there's a lot around the people management as well as what he's actually physically doing with them with any sort of splint. So, this is why we never research people in pain, because that is so complex. You're never going to get it. Mm-hmm. And you have to understand the nature of pain. But mm-hmm. there is a connection between the occlusion and the function of the joint. And there is a connection between the occlusion and the function of muscles. We know that. We've proven that. We've got the equation and we've got the data to show that. So that can affect people in terms of their pain as well. And remember, I'm coming from the 80s when, good research was showing there's no connection between occlusion and headaches. right? That was the best research that was out there. Well, they're wrong. There is. It shows the inadequacy of the research. How do we get onto that? I can't remember. But, you were talking about muscles and parafunction.
Yeah, I was talking about how strong is strong. Or, these patients I've got with really large masseters that worry me. They worry me because oh gosh, they've already broken this cusp. They've already got a virgin premolar that's now, and I've got photos on my drive of virgin premolars and molars that get vertical root fractures. And all these patients have one thing in common. Well, couple of things in common. They're parafunctional patients, and they've got significantly hypertrophic masseter in particular. Sometimes are quite often temporalis as well. So I mean, so that I want to switch these muscles off is what I'm trying to say to you, Andy. Like to let them go, and the thought of them running free and wild on those large muscles to me is going to result in another vertical root fracture with the viewpoint I have.
Let's think about it, right? First thing I would say is it both sides or is it one side? Because if it's one side, I would say there's some sort of contact there that they're really working that muscle. And remember with these, okay, that the masseters work even when there's just anterior tooth contact.
Yep. It's
actually this anterior temporalis that's not working. And if they're fracturing teeth, I wonder whether that contact, the occlusal contact is on a steep angle and there's no freedom to move around there. They're trying to get that freedom. If you open them up and gave them a centrum to work on at the back, I wonder if that would be different. I wonder if they'd stop bruxing. I wonder if they stop working on, one side of the mouth, so they get this massive muscle on one side, that things would start to balance out. In fact, I've got 800 or 900 Invisalign patients. I've had 4 with any sort of TMD issue. Bearing in mind that I don't treat them if they've got TMD as a general rule. I had one patient come in once. It was early on in my Invisalign days. And she said, I've got this terrible swelling on one side, okay? And I looked at it, and there was nothing wrong in the mouth. And she's basically got this huge masseter. And she'd been wearing aligners for about 6 or 8 weeks. So I was looking at it, I thought, wow, why is that happening? And I saw her right over to one side and really clench on it. And she had a bit of a habit. I said, okay. She was a gym bunny type as well. And she was playing on one side. So it was the time I was working with the Loughborough people. So I showed them pictures and stuff like that. I said, what am I going to do? I've built this muscle up. And they said, if you simply stop them working on it, it'll go back to normal. So she learned not to do that, and she was fine. So they're working that muscle. But I wonder if it's both sides, number one. And it immediately tells me they haven't got freedom in centric. You've got contacts on steep occlusal planes to create the forces to do fractures. Now, when we talk about putting the contacts at the back, if I've got a tooth that's heavily restored, okay, I'm not going to stick it all on a weak tooth. I'm going to bring it on other teeth as well. You've got to apply a little bit of sense here. But as a general rule, if you can get 2 or 3 good contacts on the posterior teeth with the centrum, right, that spoon, and they've got freedom to slide up and down on that guide, and that is generally a guide. It's not too steep, in which case it becomes an interference, but you aren't taking it away either, okay? Then I find that they say, yeah, I'm happy. That's what I do with my splints, and that's how I finish an Invisalign case.
How many centrums do we want?
I'm happy with, if I can get it on 2 molars, so that's 4 contacts on each side, basically.
Yep.
Okay, or 4 contacts, that would be enough. If the patient tells me they're happy, I'm happy.
So I'm really trying to make that tangible. So if you talk teeth to me, so for example, if we have upper left 7 and lower left 7, and as the patient's going into sort of a heavy sort of clench and in an excursive movement, and they're now going to have a non-working side guidance or a centrum on the contralateral. Let's say they could have it on a first molar because the second molar may be heavily restored. So now we've got 4 teeth touching and potentially 2 centrums being formed. Is that enough?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, I'm trying to think of the practical aspects of when I'm potentially going to be working with splints and stuff, and a lot of people might be thinking, okay, I want to look for these centrums in my own patients. Where can I start looking for them?
Because I don't feel a need to go in and alter the patient's teeth too much. I certainly don't want to be building up premolars to big contacts or grinding them down, unless there's a good need to do it because of the weakness of the teeth or the periodontal ligament or something like that. And I come back to what we said at the beginning, you're patient-driven in your equilibration. Just keep going until the patient says that feels comfortable. And you don't need to look too hard. And frankly, Jazz, 98% of our colleagues don't look at all. Do they? Let's face it. And if you don't look, you haven't got a problem, right?
It's true.
And the patients are okay. Because another thing that comes out of the anthropological evidence is the joint adapts to function, right? So as long as you get them fairly comfortable, the joint will adapt, they'll come back. In the old days, you'd fit a crown on the NHS, you're really short of time, it's really high, you take the patient, come back in 3 months if it's still a problem. They never come back. It all adjusts, thank God. And that's what gets us out of trouble. But that makes me less anxious as well, because I've just got to make sure they're comfortable when they leave. And I do take care with them at the end of Invisalign, because I'm known for occlusion in my area and I've got to do it right. The other thing is I work in a practice in Melton Mowbray. There's 9 other dentists there. And most of my patients come from their patients. So anything I do is checked every 6 months. And if there's ever a problem, they're straight back to me, obviously. And I've been there for 10 years now. And I've finished every one with posterior guided occlusion. And I can think of 2 patients have ever come back. I see their kids. I see their family. I treat them. They are happy with the occlusion I'm finishing them on. It really is simple. You don't really have to sweat about it.
Well, the reason I respect that coming from you is because of your diverse background in the different schools of thoughts that you've gone to listen to, and you've done probably hundreds, maybe even thousands of, let's say, Michigans, Tanners in the sort of structural school of thought. I'm sure you've done all that, and now you've made a switch some years ago to the PGO model. Are there still times where you would say, actually, I'm gonna, for whatever reason, treat this patient in a structural way and give them canine guidance? Is that something that happens?
Right. So there are times, what happens when they come away from the centrum, they then go into canine guidance or group function.
Yeah.
That's okay. So do you know Sabir Banerjee?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, lovely guy. He teaches on our diploma course. And he teaches a functional approach to occlusion. That's why he's there. And, he's talking about accepting what the patient's got. And it was working with him, I suddenly realized, I thought, what people aren't understanding is that the centrum isn't necessarily all of it, but it's the first part of it. It's the essential part of it. Where do they go after that? Well, I wouldn't want them to go on to a heavy contact on a periodontally involved central. I'd want to protect that central by them going on the canine, okay? Yeah. Or if they've got heavily restored premolars or premolars with fractures in, I don't want them going on to that. I'll take them onto the canine. So there is then the next stage from that. But usually dentists only think of that stage. They don't realize there's this initial thing altogether. And that is the essential. That's the bit that's present in nature, right? We're only trying to reflect what we know is present in nature. And nature does not give everybody ... stripe ... It doesn't.
We know that from all our AOB patients that are breathing normally and surviving just fine. I've got a great collection of AOB photos, weird and wonderful ones, and I do load testing on them. I do the Roccabado pain map on them, and they've got nothing. A lot of these patients and all that sort.
What have they got though?
They probably have a PGO, or they definitely have a PGO for sure. But yeah, they have these most likely centrums. Here's the thing, Andy, I've not been looking for these centrums. So I'm looking forward to lockdown finishing and just, with a fresh viewpoint. Now, it might take, like it took you, Andy, some some goes at it to, you followed Ron and listened to him multiple times before you say, okay, I'm going to give this a go. It might take me that sort of step. I might start with the splints first, but I've always never chased canine guidance always. I've always said, okay, for me, it was important for it to be smooth. Everything should be smooth, less resistance, and the muscles should be able to, because the more resistance you have, if someone's locked in, that's when the muscle's really going to overdrive. And, that's my sort of background, if you like, as well. Exactly. So it's not too far away from what you're saying at all. Next question is, you're obviously a very eminent speaker in orthodontics, especially clear aligners, as you talk with a diploma. So orthodontics is a full mouth rehab in enamel, let's say. When you're now setting up your Clinchcheck, I think you've already given a flavor that actually, no, we don't need to chase a class 1 and what these other orthodontists may call as a compromise, you can now accept as you're going for a functional occlusion. Is there any tips that you could give to people setting up their Clinchecks to get the right occlusal setup and occlusion at the end?
So the first thing you do is you make sure they got a happy, healthy joint before you do anything. This is exactly what we teach. Now, I teach with Raman Olak.
Yes.
He came from his school of orthodontics, which was over in Denmark. And, they weren't so wedded to class 1. And we meet up together. And, he talks about functional occlusion. I can remember actually the first time I sat with him to teach occlusion, I was really worried because I was going to come up with all this stuff. And, he couldn't accept it all straight away, but it sort of made sense. And same with Sabir. But one of the things that was so important to me about working with Raman is you think joint first, okay? So everybody should think joint first. So my first touch with a patient, after I've listened to them and what they're interested in, given them a mirror, and built a bit of a relationship with them, said, right, can I just check your jaw joint? Because it's my job to make sure that we give you a healthy, functional bite at the end. It's no good having a nice smile if you can't chew properly. And they go, yes. And you know what it is. The more times they say yes, the more they're likely to take up their treatment. It's the lightest touch, and I check their joint function. So that's the first thing I do. So invariably, thank God, 99% of patients have enough opening to chew. They might have a click, they might have a slight deviation, but it's not really a problem. I'm then checking the mouth, and I'm not seeing any significant problems with occlusal wear, mobility, recession, fracture, or anything like that. So that patient's occlusion works for them. So I'm now going to try and maintain that posterior occlusion as much as I can because I'm happy with their occlusion. So as a general rule, I do not move second and third molars. I lock them on the Clinchcheck. Okay, I'll move first molars if I want the width to get rid of the deficient buccal corridors. I need the width for space. And as another sort of general rule in terms of how I'm planning the case, how much expansion do I want? Well, I go back to the second molars. They come in, they're in generally where the zygomatic arch comes in, and I want a smile that fits the face, okay? So if they got really high cheekbones, wide, and they're wide at the back, then I feel, well, we're going to make it wider at the front as well. So I use the second molars generally as my reference point for expansion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Anybody who's familiar with the 4-sentence prescription that Raman and I developed for Invisalign will know this is just absolutely comes in there. So I generally not move the second and third molars. And so you're going to maintain your posterior occlusion. You can get intrusion, with the molars, with the aligners.
Which is why it's so good for AOB cases.
There you go. What happens then at the end of my alignment, when the patient's happy with the appearance, I'm then saying, right, we've got to make sure your bite's okay. And I'll ask them, does anything feel like it's in the way? It's patient-driven equilibration. Now, the one thing you've got to check with orthodontic patients is their teeth are mobile.
Mm.
So they'll say, yeah, I can bite okay. But what might be happening is they're biting and the anterior teeth are moving. So they're forcing those posterior teeth together. So I put my fingers on the front, or I get them to put their fingers on the front, and if they can feel any of those front teeth moving, I don't want that. So it tells me there's a slight posterior open bite, even if I can't see it. The other thing I'll put a little bit of 80 micron paper in there and get them to clench. And if it catches, then that tells me that's okay as well. I finish about 60% of my Invisalign cases with a Dahl appliance because I'm not prepared for them to have any movement of the front teeth. And if I'm honest, I'm not that bothered about having any anterior tooth contact at all. And so if there's any movement or they don't really feel like they can bite really well on their back teeth or that paper comes through, I'll get the last lower aligner, trim it distal to the canines and send them away using the upper aligner as a retainer. And usually I say it might take 6 to 8 weeks, but over 2 or 3 weeks, those posterior teeth come together. Now, I don't know if the anteriors have intruded, the posteriors have super erupted, or whether the condyl's changed. I don't know. But they get the back teeth together, and then I'm happy. Constantly asking the patient, is it comfortable for you? That's enough. I don't really worry too much about what the actual contacts are, because in function, they'll be telling me if they're in the way, basically. And if they're not in the way, they can chew what they like. That's all that matters to me.
I really like that answer. So that answers it very well. So how Andy approaches the occlusion, so not moving the second molars and third molars, and at the end using the aligners as a Dahl appliance. Fantastic. Just a couple more. Yes, go on.
Well, one other point there is cross bites. We get a bit worried about cross bites as well. If I've got like molars in cross bite and there's no hit and slide, there's no functional issues, I'll often leave a cross bite. There's nothing to say, you can get good occlusal function when the teeth are in cross bite because it's that initial movement that's important, not the fact that it's inside or outside, class 1, 2, or 3. It's that centrum that's important. So I'll often leave a cross bite as well.
I tell you, Andy, I wish that I can think of a couple of patients where I wish I left a crossbite.
Right.
So,
why make life complicated, right?
It's so true. It takes an awful while sometimes. One thing I forgot to ask you is how important is for your patients to be in quote unquote centric relation when all this is happening? How important is for the condyle to be the definition of the anteromedial part of the condyle to be on the posterior part of the sort of articulate eminence? Does it matter?
What the hell is centric relation, right? So in our world, centric relation is a border position. It's not necessarily the functional position. They actually function further forward than that in various positions. Mm-hmm. So the way, if you watch, I learned by manipulation technique, and at the Pank Institute, they got this fantastic bit of kit which shows you exactly where the condyle is and how much force you're supposed to put on and stuff like that. And with some patients, it works really well. Other patients, they're all over the place. So when you watch Ron do it, he's talking them into it actually, and you'll just put a little bit of pressure on their chin and just get them to open and close gently. And what you're looking for is actually a muscle-defined position where they want to function, okay? And if it's a patient with TMD, you might not find that straight away because they're all over the place. But in your average, Invisalign patient, for instance, and you're checking, is there a hit and slide? You just get them nice and quiet. You try and get them to stop thinking about their teeth. And you put a little bit of pressure down. Sometimes I get them to lift their tongue up. And that will just put the condyles in roughly the right place with the teeth not interfering. And then you get them to close together. And their function defines the condylar position. That's the point. It's not you pushing them into a position. Now, the people like centric relation because you can get back to it all the time. Mm-hmm. So, but you lose the point of it. That's not a bad thing to know, but it's not their function. It's just a reference point. And it's the back end of that functional area, if you like.
So what you're trying to say is that although you're not too hung up on it, you're still sort of, when you're maybe equilibrating for someone to achieve PGO, you are trying to approximately get to centric relation?
Well, I'm aware of it, but I'm certainly not pushing them back. And
okay.
Again, I'm letting them drive me. So generally, if they've had a splint, the muscles balance up, okay, start to work properly. The joint gets to where it wants to be. Mm-hmm. And then they take the splint out. You find the teeth are not in the right place. So you basically then get them to just remember where it was without the splint, and then show me where it touches. And then they'll tell you, basically, oh yeah, that feels like it's in the way. Because you've done that reprogramming, of the whole neuromusculature with the splint, as
Brilliant.
you know.
Fantastic. I'm just now checking if I've got any more questions left. Let's see. Okay, so last question then, and then I'll offer it to you to put any final points if you'd like to. So it's a very educational episode. I've really enjoyed listening to you, Andy. So
Thank you.
The question is, some schools of thought suggest that MIP is a pathological position.
Okay.
So that actually we shouldn't, our teeth shouldn't really be touching. So if you look at and of course you may argue that the quality of evidence is not good, and that's a very valid point. But I believe it's 1964, the Graf paper, which showed using the latest technology they had at the time, was that our teeth should only touch for 17.5 minutes per day. And even then, not much force, and it's like we said, those fleeting contacts. Whereas you offered a theory of actually we need to have a healthy clench, which wasn't mentioned in a paper such as that, for example. Yeah. So some people say that MIP is a pathological position, and frankly, what contacts there are in MIP is not important in the non-parafunctional patient. Can you explain your views, and then also freedom from Centric or freedom in Centric at maximum force? That is something that maybe only happens in parafunction. But I think you've answered that. Actually, the healthy clench is part of health. So I think you may have already answered that. But what do you think about that view that MIP is is a parafunctional position in itself?
So to me, it's what's the quality of the contacts when they are in MIP. And if you've got contacts that are on steep inclines and they're locked in, then that's going to create, we certainly know it's going to create problems with the teeth, okay? We know that those sort of contacts will switch muscles off. And remember, I wonder if that's such an old paper, whether it's coming from the old tripodization philosophy. It's actually a commentary on the old tripodization philosophy. It was when, dentists got so into their engineering that they believed that a good occlusion was 3 contacts for every cusp, right? It locked the patient in. And here's another story. I wasn't there. Ron wasn't there, but Ron knew somebody who was there. And this is the birth of Canine Guidance, right? So there's this high-powered study club. And I can't remember whether it was East Coast or West Coast, but through the 50s and 60s, there was like 2 battling schools of thought, East Coast and West Coast of the States, and one was about tripodization. And the story goes that this dentist's wife had her mouth restored by this top-level occlusionist, okay, and she had gold on all her occlusal surfaces, ultimate mouth jewelry, tripodized contacts, and within a few days, she's in terrible pain. So what they did was they ground all the contacts down and they left her with Canine Guidance, and she got better.
Okay.
And so, she got better because of Canine Guidance. Whereas if you took a functional point of view, no, she got better because you gave her some freedom. You got rid of those tight contacts. So I don't know, Jazz, about that, but I wonder whether that's part of the reason for that paper was to say you should not be locking people in.
Okay, that's we'll never know. I mean, I've got the paper I can send to you, but essentially it's that, you must have heard that, the 17.5-minute chewers that really the teeth should only really touch when swallowing. So it's a difficult, it's a lot of the background stuff that I come from. The other thing I want to ask
actually... How do they measure that? How do they measure that? Right?
It's a technique where they use some sort of laser or something. I forgot what it was now. It's a term. I'll send you the paper. It's just interesting. Anyway, and this is widely cited, this paper. Even I cite it, and I say, how often should our teeth touch together? And something I say to my patients, actually, so one thing that I think we can both accept is that at rest, it should be lips together, teeth apart. So that's essentially what I teach my patients, that you shouldn't actually be grinding, clenching. That's parafunction. So I think it stems from that as well. But what do you think about PGO, and does it have any similarity to the 60s and 70s, the balanced occlusion? Is that different to PGO?
Well, from what I understand with a balanced occlusion, it was a denture occlusion, and they're saying that you should be, and that's why you had the curves of Speyer and Wilson.
But they were applying it to a dentate
to a dentate patient. So I'm not aware. I couldn't give you a decent answer on that because I don't exactly know what they mean by balanced occlusion.
Fine.
I mean, I don't think Ron and Henry came up with these ideas themselves necessarily. They were part of. Ron's written a book about Henry Tanner. And if you read about Henry Tanner, he started dentistry in 1946, and he was given the job of equilibration in 1946. So, there were all these competing theories all the time. So it may well be that this idea of balanced occlusion was around, but it hasn't been described as fully as Ron and Henry have gone on to do that. And Ron has gone and got the evidence for it as well. And remember, you can't get some of this evidence because the maths didn't exist in those days. So you can see how these whole ideas have changed. And what we accept today as being obvious isn't obvious then. And we come back, if there's one closing thing that we want to come back to, and you've mentioned it, you say it's your worldview, for instance. Well, we're talking about theory. Okay. Now, the purpose of theory, if you want to get back to science philosophy, the purpose of theory is to explain as succinctly as possible all these different facts that are out there. There are facts out there that are not explained by a particular theory. And as the science develops, a new theory comes along that not only explains these facts, but can explain those things as well. And that's the way that science develops. And I think now with PGO, we have a theory. It's not necessarily a perfect description, but it's a better description of the real world than the theory of the structural theory, which explained that, when you put people in canine guidance, they get better. All right. So that's where we're at. And this whole process is replicated throughout science. But as scientists, as science students, we're not taught about all those competing theories. Mm-hmm. We're taught about the one that becomes the truth. If you're in social science, it's all about the competing theories. And as I was teaching this social science for the education course, I recognized that actually this whole thing around occlusion is just the same. And one day, possibly, everybody will see, actually, this theory, and maybe PGO, explains more things to me and allows me to get on with my life than the old theory does. And then as we develop and have more conversations like this, PGO will develop as well, and it will develop into something else. But I think personally, we're at a point where we not only have clinical experience, lots of our friends and colleagues not bothering with occlusion, and the patients aren't queuing up in terrible pain. We have experiences like we have in terms of what you've done with splints. We have the evidence like Ron's audit. I did audit on his pain patients, for instance, how quickly they got better. We've got all his pictures of his splints. We've got our experiences that we do with, for instance, me finishing off these Invisalign patients over 10 years in this practice where all my patients are being checked every 6 months by general dentists just like you and me. And we have the dentures that show the effect on how changing the occlusal planes to match the functional surfaces of the joint makes an absolutely stable denture without implants. And then finally, we have the equation. And all those different bits of facts can be explained by this theory. It explains all of those things. Not one of those bits of evidence is enough to convince anybody that this is the truth. Mm-hmm. But you put them all together, and to me, it explains the truth in a much more complete and simple way than anything else I've come across. And that's basically it.
Fantastic. Well, I really appreciate the time to share about the origins of PGO and also look at the structural view. You've answered a whole lot of questions that people out there might be thinking. And if anyone wants to, comment, write in, and I can always send these questions to Andy. And if there's any resources, please, Andy, email to me and I'll put them on as part of the downloads for this episode. I think you've summed it up very beautifully at the end there, almost poetic. But is there anything that you'd like to, you've got the microphone now?
Well, mainly to thank you, Jazz, for this opportunity, and to be questioned by you and challenged by you is a joy. And all your listeners and people watching out there, come back with the questions, okay? Because it makes it, the model needs testing and it needs developing as well. But what I would ask everybody to do now is to understand that the way they've seen the world can be seen in a different way. It's like a different set of glasses, and start to look at the back of the mouth as well as at the front, and start to think about function rather than structure. And let's keep talking, and let's help develop these ideas. It really should be simple, and hopefully will be. I really, really appreciate what you're doing here, Jazz. Thank you.
No, thanks for coming on. And as I said in one of my every episode, I start with something called a protrusive dental pearl, like a little tip. It could be dentistry, it could be something else. And one of the pearls I shared maybe 5 or 6 episodes ago was a quote from Malcolm Gladwell, and it was, "There's something very unattractive about someone who refuses to change their mind." So right. I think I'm always open to. Right. I completely accept, put my hands up, that what I believe now may be different to what I will believe in 5 years, and I've got no problem to change my mind as long as the evidence, and evidence, like you said, has many arms. There's a whole clinical practice arm of evidence as well. So I think everyone should keep an open mind, and I'd like to have discussions like this in the future. And I think this is how the profession will develop in all the ways. Yes. But I think with occlusion, which lacks a lot of evidence, it'd be great to test PGO more and really look at the different models, like we are social scientists as well. Yes, exactly. So, Occlusion Geeks, thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. I hope you found that really useful. For those who haven't downloaded Dr. Andy Toy's ebook, that was available with part 1 in the show notes. Just go on the protrusive.co.uk website. And again, like always, I really appreciate you listening all the way to the end. Loads of cool speakers coming up. I've got Richard Porter on emotional intelligence. I've got Zach Kara back again, as well as Gurusemi, talking both about presenting treatment plans and a little bit about, the whole case acceptance kind of thing. How can we actually get our patients to understand our treatment plans and go ahead with what we think is the best thing for them? Imminently, we're coming up one about careers and actually making yourself employable, and also Amma Johal and airway, which is going to be a massive, very much a topic that is not talked about enough. So really excited to get that content all out to you very soon. It does take some hours per episode to actually produce it all and get it all edited. So stick with me, and I really look forward to sharing that with you. Take care.